Back in 1968, the murder of 2 toddlers at the hands of a 10-year-old, blue-eyed psychopath shook Britain to its core. Never, in all of British history, had a child this young ever been accused of a crime so heinous and terrible. The justice system had no rulebook to follow, so they made one up as they went. They had no choice. Mary Bell quite literally rewrote the law with her utterly wicked acts against the smallest and weakest members of our society. But as inconceivably horrifying as the murders of Mary Bell were, they almost pale in comparison to the terrible life that she had to endure in her 10 short years on this earth before she killed those 2 helpless babies. Are monsters born, or are they made to be the way they are? In Mary's case, it's hard to tell, because her past was filled with more neglect and abuse than most children could possibly endure, and still managed to stay alive. Let's look at Mary Bell, her tragic early life, her terrible crimes, and her uncertain future. Mary was born in Scotswood, a suburb in Scotland, just a stone's throw away from Denton. It was one of the many poverty-stricken places that came out of the war in such rough shape that it wasn't fit for human occupation at all. The whole of Scotland was in the midst of tearing down the broken and unsafe buildings where the most impoverished in the country lived, slowly rebuilding new public housing and flats. But Scotswood was one of the last places to get an upgrade. The suburb remained the same derelict slum it had always been, long before Mary was born and long after she left. To call the poor areas of Scotland slums is almost an understatement. These places were extremely overcrowded, with the absolute poorest families crammed amongst the most violent criminals in Scotland. Most of the housing was falling apart and was completely unsafe for the people living there. Roofs caving in and entire streets flooding with sewage debris from open drain pipes were common. Crime was so out of control that, quite frankly, the police rarely bothered to show up when they were called, unless someone actually died. The residents didn't even dare to hang their washing outside to dry. It would just be stolen from the line if they did, like everything else that was left unsupervised for even a second. Sadly, the same precautions weren't taken for the children of Scotswood. The streets were filled with unsupervised kids during the day. The few adults that were fortunate enough to work in the surrounding factories, despite their meagre wages, couldn't afford childcare. And the ones who weren't working, which were most of the people there, were sleeping off last night's drunken binge or conducting illegal business of some sort in the shadows. The youngest members of the neighbourhood were left to run wild during the day, playing in the demolition areas among shards of glass, half-broken brick walls, and open pipes. And when the night came, they hid from the brawls and violence that flooded the streets when the darkness descended. Sometimes the biggest danger came from their own parents. Scotswood was tough, and the kids who made it had to be even tougher. These were the conditions that Mary Flora Bell was born into. She was the second child of Elizabeth Bell, a prostitute who lived on White House Road. White House Road had a reputation as being one of the worst places anyone could possibly live. And in a place as dangerous as Scotswood, being called one of the most dangerous streets in the area was quite an accomplishment. No one had it worse than those who lived in the back streets. To tell Mary's story, we need to look at her mother first and the terrible abuse that Mary endured at the hands of the woman who was supposed to care for her the most. Elizabeth, or Betty, as most people called her, was a strange and dangerous woman. Whatever demons haunted her, she passed it on to her daughter, or maybe those demons created the child killer that Mary would later become. Whichever the case, any child born to Betty Bell was sure to suffer a life rife with uncertainty, neglect, and violence. As a child, Betty was so religious and obsessed with scripture and church that her parents thought that she would become a nun someday. But when her father died in her preteen years, Betty's life began to take a demented path. She became prone to violent outbursts and tantrums, actively trying to traumatize her mother and siblings with her cruel and hurtful pranks, going so far as to stage her own drug overdose just to get her mother's reaction. In between outbursts and running away from her home several times, Betty made her money by walking the streets. Predictably, Betty got pregnant. By the time she was 17, she already had her second child, Mary, who was born on May 26, 1957. Betty never told anyone who Mary's biological father was, and by that time, she'd run around so much that it was impossible to make assumptions about his identity. When the nurses tried to place the newborn baby in her arms, Betty pushed the bundle away, telling the nurses to "get that thing away from me." And those first hurtful words were only the beginning. From the moment that Mary took her first breath, it was clear that her mother wanted nothing to do with her. Betty frequently dropped her children off at family members' houses, only to disappear for days or weeks at a time. Mary was always dirty, unkept, and usually hungry. By now, the family knew that Betty was probably involved in sex work and that she used drugs and drank heavily. They feared for the kids' safety and suggested several times that Betty sign the children over to them. But no matter how many days or weeks she disappeared for, Betty always returned and took her children back. The family knew that the children weren't living in the most stable circumstances, but they had no idea just how bad things truly were when Mary was in her mother's care. For the first year or two of Mary's life, she was often left alone in the house while Betty saw clients. Betty wouldn't return for hours at a time. Sometimes she'd been gone all night and most of the morning before Mary and her older sibling saw another living person at all. The fact that any of Betty's children survived this level of neglect is astounding. The effects of these extended periods of abandonment were becoming apparent to the family when Betty dropped her daughter off with them. Mary never cried, not even when she got hurt. She'd learned quickly enough that crying didn't bring help, so she never bothered to express her sadness or physical pain with tears like babies usually do. Mary's social skills were non-existent, and even though she expressed interest in other children, she just didn't seem to know how to play with them. Even though the deadpan expression in her bright blue eyes and her silence was unnerving, Betty's extended family provided her with most of the toys, clothes, and stability that her mother wasn't giving her, only for it to be taken away when Betty rocked up at the door and whisked her children away again. When Mary was 2, Betty married a man called William Bell. Billy was a common street criminal, mostly getting by on petty theft and armed robbery. For all Billy's sins on the streets, he was at least warm and kind to all of the children in the home. Mary grew up believing him to be her father, at least until the media picked up on the dysfunctional family when she was later arrested. Unfortunately, Billy's loving and much-needed presence was hampered by his heavy drinking. Some say he drank even more than Betty did. The two had explosive fights that usually ended in physical altercations, and his presence in the home was just as unpredictable as his wife's. The small, cramped flat that they lived in had once been used to store coal. Betty didn't bother to clean the soot off the floor and walls from the room her children slept in. They had very little furniture and only a coal stove that was used both for cooking and for heat in the bitterly cold winter. The house was also frequented by acquaintances of the Bells, most of whom had criminal backgrounds. Furthermore, there are a few alarming and downright horrific events in Mary's first few years that need mentioning. Betty sold Mary off to a mentally unstable woman that she met in front of an orphanage. It cost Betty's sister to travel across the country to track the woman down and retrieve Mary. And still, for some inexplicable reason, Betty refused to give Mary over to her family when they begged her to hand the children over to them. Mary was dropped from a first-floor window, and though Betty claimed it was an accident, it's thought that she was trying to kill the then 2-year-old. And Betty's attempts to kill her own daughter didn't stop there. On another occasion, Betty gave Mary sleeping pills to quiet the child down so that she could go out for the night. And this habit of medicating her children became a habit of Betty's. Her children were all treated in the emergency room on multiple occasions for overdoses on their mother's prescription medication. All 5 of Betty's children showed obvious signs of abuse and neglect, but their bruises and cuts were easily overlooked by schools and neighbours. Most of Scotswood's children played among the rubble of condemned buildings, and every child carried some evidence of their unsupervised adventures. Billy didn't protect his children at all, but then again he was at the receiving end of his wife's outburst too. Neighbours once saw Betty beating him and one of her other children with a dog chain. Of all of their drunken fights, Billy usually came off the worst. There are some rumours involving dropping Mary from a 3rd-floor window and that her mother tried to drown her in the bathtub. But these 2 attempted murders are based on rumours. They were never confirmed or reported. Given Betty's erratic behaviour and her habit of self-medicating with alcohol and prescription and street drugs, it's thought that she probably suffered from bipolar disorder or some other serious mental health condition. Whatever the case, she seemed to resent every one of her children, and they learned to fear the rare occasions that their mother was home. But none more so than Mary. Betty's family has claimed that she truly seemed to hate Mary especially, even more than she despised the rest of her kids. To further complicate the children's expectations of their mother, after an outburst from Betty, she could turn around in an instant and ply them with sweets and hugs as compensation, or she'd whip out the dog chain. Betty's temperament was about as predictable as her time spent at home. In later interviews conducted by police, Mary said that the only time the house had any sense of calm was when her mother left for Glasgow, where she took her services when money ran out. Then Mary was left in the care of her father, Billy. Most of the time, he was intoxicated or hungover, or he wasn't there at all and spent the night out at the pub or drinking on the street. As criminal, neglectful, and afraid of his wife as he was, at least Billy was always warm and kind towards his children. He and the family dog were the only constants Mary had in her life, the only living things that didn't come and go like the rest. When it came to Betty's profession, just like her home life, she preferred things to get violent with her clients too. Betty specialized in BDSM and kept the tools of her trade hidden in the home. The children knew where the whips and handcuffs were kept, and they also knew what their mother would do to them if they were ever found looking through her things. Betty took most of her work to Glasgow, but it wasn't unusual for her to bring clients to her house. The place was so small and the walls so thin that the children knew perfectly well what was going on, and they went to extreme lengths to get as far away from the house as they possibly could whenever they saw strange men come over to spend the night. Obviously, this toxic and downright extreme household would have put all of the children in danger of some form of abuse from the people that their parents allowed inside the home. Betty's other children have always claimed that their mother kept her work away from the children as much as she could in the small confines of the house, and that they never saw anything outright, nor were they brought into direct contact with the men that visited the home. But Mary said otherwise. According to her, her own mother started sexually abusing her since she could remember. By the time Mary was 4 or 5 years old, Betty started selling her daughter to her clients too. If you're wondering where the heck social services were when there were babies being brought into the ER for overdoses and the house was used as a brothel in full view of the neighbours, well, they did come around every now and then, but Scotswood was full of households like the Bells, and to take a child into care in the 1960s in Scotland meant putting them into an orphanage that was probably overcrowded already. Abuse and neglect of children were common in these institutions, even those that were run by the church. The concept of foster care was just starting to come onto the scene, so unless a child was in danger of dying, placing them in these bleak and depressing conditions was truly the very last option on the table. It might have also been that those that came around weren't aware of the reality of the state that the Bell children were in. Betty certainly didn't tell them everything that was going on, and the neighbours covered up for them too. This wasn't because anyone agreed with Betty's methods. It's because they distrusted authority more than they feared for the lives of the children. This was the kind of place where children were cared for by the community, and if things got out of hand, the people handled it themselves before getting the authorities involved. The police only came by when someone died, so why would they expect anything more from authorities when it came to matters that happened in a private home? Unsurprisingly, Mary's behaviour was unmanageable. Her kindergarten teachers and the rare childminders that met her described her as very bright but naughty and volatile. The other children bullied Mary relentlessly about her mother's profession, the unsavoury street she lived on, and her general oddness. Mary was never very adept at being social, and she was awkward with structured play. The other children's teasing would inevitably be met with punches, biting, and screaming fits from Mary. At this stage, Mary's outbursts were an emotional response to the teasing, violent or not. At least she lashed out for a reason. But that would all change drastically when Mary was 5. She, along with several other children, witnessed another child's death when he was struck by a bus. After that day, something in Mary switched off. She'd never cried much before. She might have laughed a little less than other children, and she had a short-tempered streak to her, but at least Mary was still a child with childlike emotions, albeit volatile and muted. But they were there, at least to some degree. That all stopped after she witnessed death for the first time. Children on the playground became afraid of Mary after that day. She'd displayed anger before, as a result of the bullying she'd endured. Mary now became the bully herself, and she seemed to get a great deal of pleasure from causing others pain. When Mary's blue eyes got that blank stare that she became known for, the children ran from her in fear. That detached and soulless gaze was always followed by a physical altercation. She lost all interest in schoolwork and group activities, and she now only seemed to laugh if she could make others cry. Mary was becoming as manic as her mother, a pint-sized little monster whose mad cackles rang over the playground when children fled from her, usually after she'd hurt them in some way. Mary developed the habit of trying to strangle other children when she got into arguments with them. The strangulation and punching evolved into putting cigarettes out on another girl's cheek and petty vandalism around the neighbourhood. If she wasn't acting violently, then Mary was telling lies. Her tales became taller and taller with time, until not even the children believed her stories anymore. Mary was escalating rapidly. By the time she reached the age of 10, Mary was the child that parents warned their children about, not that they needed to. The kids wanted nothing to do with a girl that was more likely to hurt them than anything else. The only child with whom Mary really had any permanent contact was Norma Bell. Despite sharing the same last name, the two were not related. Norma lived 2 houses down from Mary, and even though she was 2 years older than Mary, the two were almost always together. But poor Norma was no match for Mary. Shy, timid, and submissive, Norma struggled in school and had no other friends besides Mary. Where Mary was described as intelligent, Norma was the exact opposite. Intellectually, she just couldn't compete on Mary's level. Mary's harsh and overbearing personality just dominated Norma completely, and everywhere that Mary went, her lamb was sure to go. During the day, they'd wander around the abandoned houses, and they sat in the demolished ruins, daydreaming about running away from their deplorable circumstances. They discussed killing and torture, or at least Mary did, with Norma being the enthralled audience. Finally, a person who was willing to give Mary the undivided attention she so desperately craved. Unfortunately, Norma's past isn't clear, with all of the focus of the media turned on her 11-year-old, dark-haired and blue-eyed psychotic little best friend. Norma's identity was overshadowed by Mary. But that should give you an idea of what sort of relationship the two had with each other. Mary sought out someone that she could command, overpower, and subjugate to her will. Norma wasn't like the other children who fought back or told on her to the teachers. With Norma, Mary could exert all of the control that Betty enforced on Mary back home. Mary terrorized the streets, and Norma followed her, doing whatever Mary told her to do. Smoking on street corners, breaking windows and starting fights. The two were the perfect little pair of budding criminals. On Saturday, the 11th of May, 1968, their violent daydreaming finally came to a head. The two lured a 3-year-old boy by taking him to a sweet shop that morning. They gave him candy, and he followed them out of the store to go play at an abandoned air raid shelter. Whether or not they planned the attack, or Mary acted on an impulsive urge at the moment, is unclear. Either way, Mary pushed the boy off the roof of the building. He suffered a serious laceration to his head and was very confused and in a state of panic after the fall. The girls then walked him to the nearest pub and gave him off to a man standing outside, just telling him that they found the boy injured and that he needed help. The man called the police from the pub's landline, and the child was taken to the hospital. The 3-year-old told police that he'd been playing with the girls when one of them pushed him off the roof. But since the girls were the ones to raise the alarm and seemed genuinely concerned, they assumed that the child was getting the details wrong due to his young age and the wound on his head. They never even filed a report on the incident. Mary had just gotten away with her first crime, and she liked how it felt. Just one day after attempting to murder the toddler, the pair accosted 3 girls between the ages of 6 and 7. Cindy, Susie, and Pauline were playing in a sandpit that afternoon. They got into an argument after Mary told them to leave their playing place, resulting in an attack from Mary. One by one, she tried to strangle each one of them, but they fought her off. When Mary grabbed the last girl, Pauline, around the neck, Pauline fought back hard. So Mary changed tactics and tried to force sand down her throat instead. But Norma did something out of character. She begged Mary to stop, and in that moment of distraction, the 3 children were able to escape and run home to tell their parents what had happened. Pauline's mother reported the assault to the police, and they brought Mary and Norma in for questioning. As expected, Mary denied the whole ordeal right there on the spot. But Norma came out with the truth almost immediately. Or some of it, at least. The problem was that Pauline hadn't told her parents or the police that Mary had tried to gag her with sand. She was afraid of what Mary would do to her if she told the whole truth. So the police assumed that it was nothing more than a sandpit brawl between the hooligan children of Scotswood. Had the police done their job properly, Mary might not have felt impervious to the repercussions of her escalating violence. But they did not press the matter further, and for the second time in as many days, Mary and Norma walked away from attempted murder. Mary might have realized that she was going to start attracting attention if she went on the way she did, so laid low for 2 weeks. Saturday morning on the 25th, she was out roaming the streets alone, and this time Mary came across Martin Brown, a 4-year-old who was playing out in Rat Alley with some other children his age. The children with Martin were quite young themselves, so it's uncertain how she lured Martin away or exactly what she did to him. Martin was found hours later, dead in the upstairs bedroom of another one of Scotswood's condemned buildings. He was fully clothed, his arms outstretched above his head, and besides a little foam and a trickle of blood on his chin, there were no other signs of injuries or a struggle. The 3 exploring children who'd found him ran to the nearest adult they could find, a workman walking past. He told the children to call the police, threw down the pickaxe he was carrying, and ran to the building that the children indicated toward. While the man was attempting CPR on the child, a crowd of curious onlookers, mostly children, started to form around the building. Mary went to fetch Norma after she'd left Martin dead, and they were among the growing crowd. Mary took Norma by the hand and led her to where the workman was trying to revive the child, who'd been dead for at least 2 hours by that point. He chased them away from the doorway where they were looking in at the scene, just as Martin's mother and police arrived. June Brown was notified that Martin was found unresponsive in a broken-down building by some children, and she ran to the scene, arriving as the workman was carrying her ashen-faced and obviously dead son out of the building, handing the tiny body over to police. Police found medication strewn on the floor of the apartment, left there by the previous tenant. So they presumed that this was an unfortunate accident of a toddler overdosing on the medication. However, the presence of medication in the apartment was never released to the public. This was a good thing, because the theory of an accidental overdose was proven false as soon as Martin arrived at the coroner's office, and it would be what alerted them to the truth much later on. The tablets were just aspirin. It was highly unlikely that Martin could have overdosed on them. He would have had to ingest much more than half of one bottle for him to even start showing signs of distress. At most, he'd have gotten very sick and started vomiting up the contents of his stomach, but there were no signs of it at the scene, and no aspirin in his digestive tract was found either. The coroner couldn't definitively determine Martin's death. There were no outward injuries to indicate foul play after all. The police did not think this was an accident, but they had no clues to indicate that an assault had taken place, or anything else for that matter, that could have been the cause of Martin's demise. Now it's theorized that Mary strangled him or smothered Martin in some other way by covering his mouth and nose. That would explain the foam around his mouth and the blood, possibly from blood vessels in his throat and nose rupturing as he struggled to breathe. There's no way to know for sure, and Mary certainly never said anything. The next day, on the 26th, was Mary's 11th birthday. Not expecting cake or a party, Mary went to Norma's house for the day, and they played there for a few hours as if nothing had happened the day before. Mary got into an argument over a toy with Norma's younger sister and tried to strangle her in a fit of rage. Luckily, the girl's father was home and caught Mary before she could do any serious harm. He gave her a clip on the shoulder and sent her home. Mary and Norma found each other again soon enough, and they wandered the streets for the rest of the day. Mary was fuming with anger over the telling off she'd gotten. She was seeking out a place where she could take her anger out on. She and Norma broke into a children's nursery by gaining access through a window. Together, the girls smashed paint pots, overturned chairs and tables, and left some disturbing notes written on the wall for the staff to find on Monday morning, essentially admitting to the crime. When staff came in the next day, they reported the break-in, but since nothing was stolen, and this kind of vandalism was common in the area, police dismissed the confession graffiti. Misspelt and written in childlike handwriting, it looked like a tasteless and cruel prank perpetrated by children and nothing more. The disturbing notes didn't stop there. At the same time that police were at the nursery, Mary wrote in her school newspaper about the death of Martin Brown. She was careful enough not to confess to anything. It was worded to look like she'd been one of the people in the crowd that had gathered at the scene. She doodled a little picture at the bottom of the page of Martin's body, the workman finding him, and even a bottle of pills lying next to the boy. But none of the teachers made any connection to the drawings or the crime. Mary wasn't the only child who'd stood in the crowd and written about it. The whole school was buzzing with the news. After school came out, Mary went over to Martin's mother's house. June often babysat the children of the neighbourhood during the day, so Mary's presence there wasn't unusual. Mary, however, had a lot of questions for the grieving mother. She asked if she was missing Martin, how she felt, and expressed a great deal of concern over June's well-being. But Mary's sympathy took an eerie turn on the day that Martin's funeral was scheduled. That morning, Mary and Norma knocked on the door and asked June if they could see her son Martin. At first, June was confused. The girls knew full well that Martin was dead. They couldn't possibly see him, and she told them so. But Mary corrected her, saying she wanted to see Martin's body before the funeral. June slammed the door in the girls' faces and collapsed in a hysterical state behind the door. Mary's visit had upset her so much that June's husband rushed his distressed wife to the hospital. Heavily sedated and leaning on her husband for support, June managed to make it to her son's funeral on time. After the funeral of Martin Brown, Newcastle was in an uproar. They blamed the child's death on the unsafe conditions of the slums. Buildings were being torn down with the promise of new housing replacing them, but the cleanup and construction had been going on for years by now. The unsafe conditions were the cause of numerous injuries and even some deaths among the impoverished people of Scotland. Most of the injuries were that of children, playing in the ruins. Marches were being organised across Newcastle, and in front of the march in Scotswood stood Mary, holding a banner up high with the rest of the protesters. The murder she'd committed was the reason for a countrywide spectacle. Scotland might as well have thrown a parade just for Mary's horrendous crime, and they didn't even know it. Mary spent the next 2 months going back to her usual routine, terrorising the children, vandalising buildings, and staying away from home when Betty was there. But Mary found this normality rather boring after committing murder. So she resorted to openly boasting about Martin's death. She told everyone that crossed her path that she'd killed the boy in Rat Alley, and if the others didn't watch out, she'd kill them too. But like all of Mary's enormous and fanciful lies, this was just seen as another one of her theatrical displays in an attempt to domineer and frighten smaller children into submission. Norma was also at the receiving end of Mary's fury now. Even though she was taller and much stronger than Mary was, Norma was too timid and afraid to offer resistance to Mary's outbursts. Mary punched and scratched Norma's face every time the girl made Mary angry, or even just if she happened to be close enough to Mary's hands when some benign thing caused Mary to go into a rage. For 2 months, the only trouble in Scotswood was Mary's tantrums and boasts. Children in the neighbourhood regularly played in front of Howe's family home, Mary and Norma included. The family who lived there reported, much later, that Mary had told them that she knew what happened to Martin Brown. It was Norma who killed him, she said. Why Mary would throw her only friend, a completely loyal minion, under the bus without any prompting is very indicative of a child who placed no value in friendship or loyalty. Mary was not interested in long-lasting relationships, and she was getting bored with Norma's unwavering attention and lesser intelligence. Norma's only value to the budding psychopath was if Mary could dominate her and take her anger out on another living being, and even that was starting to bore Mary. On the 31st of July, on a Wednesday afternoon, Mary and Norma were at the Howe house, playing in the street with some children. Howe's youngest son, 3-year-old Brian, was with the group of about a dozen kids. At one point, all of the children abandoned their game to go and watch a demolition in progress going on in Rat Alley. When the children raced ahead to see the bulldozers and heavy machinery in action, no one noticed Mary slip away with Brian in the commotion. She took him to a wasteland that the children referred to as Tin Lizzie. Brian's absence wasn't noticed until it started to get dark, and he failed to come home when the streetlights came on. Brian's older sister, Pat, was sent out to look for him, and the family wasn't overly concerned just yet. After all, the kids of Scotswood had a habit of losing track of time during their adventures in the neighbourhood that offered an endless supply of empty houses and places to poke around in. The teenager asked a few children if they'd seen her little brother, but none of them had. She found Mary still in the streets, and Mary told her that she'd last seen Brian playing in Tin Lizzie. Pat didn't go looking for him there. Tin Lizzie was a dumping ground for construction material, and even though teenagers sometimes hung out there, the little ones tended to avoid the dangerous place. So she continued asking around if anyone had seen Brian. She and her parents were starting to get worried as night fell completely. Even if he did end up at a friend's house, surely the parents would have sent him home by now. The police were called and the neighbours flooded the alleyways and searched the empty buildings for little Brian. It wasn't long before they discovered Brian lying dead between 2 blocks of concrete, right where Mary told Pat he was last seen. But unlike Martin, there was no doubt that this was murder. Martin's body was hastily covered with grass and pieces of construction material that littered the ground at Tin Lizzie. Furthermore, little Brian's remains were in a terrible state. He was partially naked, with scrapes and bruises covering his body. He had numerous shallow puncture wounds over his legs, and clumps of his curly blonde hair were strewn on the ground. The damage was attributed to a pair of scissors lying nearby. And to add to the disturbing scene, his genitals were severely mutilated by those same scissors. The Scotswood police were wise enough to realise that they were in over their heads with such a violent and gruesome crime. They dispersed the crowd, taped off the scene, and called in Detective Harvey Burrows. That's when everyone knew that things were more serious than a simple accident, like they'd assumed. Burrows was the heaviest gun in the police force, famous for solving even the most grisly crimes. At the coroner's office, Detective Burrows was let in on some more disturbing details. Brian's wounds weren't the reason for his death after all. The cause of death was strangulation. The cuts on his legs were all superficial and occurred post-mortem, as did most of his other injuries. One of the cuts looked like a crude attempt to carve out the letter M on the boy's thigh. The cut marks that made the carving did not match the scissors. Somewhere, there was another weapon that they still needed to find. All of the cuts made by the unknown weapon and the puncture wounds inflicted by the scissors weren't done with great force. It all indicated that the weapons were wielded by someone who was physically incapable of applying a lot of pressure. The coroner concluded that this was done by a child, under the age of 14 at least. Burrows called for the case of Martin Brown to be reopened. The chances of 2 deaths occurring in the same neighbourhood just 2 months apart were astronomical. Both children were found in places that were secluded. Both were the same age and gender. And if Detective Burrows' suspicions were right, Martin was strangled just like Brian was. He decided to keep the details of the scissors at the scene quiet, just like they had done with the bottle of aspirin found next to Martin. When the residents got wind of the fact that investigators were looking for a child, the reports started streaming in faster than police could file them. And all of the children who came forward had the exact same story. Mary and Norma Bell were neighbourhood hooligans who bullied and vandalised everything in sight, living or not. Mary was especially feared, and she told everyone who would listen that she killed Brian and Martin. The children only cemented what the police were already starting to suspect. They'd already noticed a familiar face whenever they came to Scotswood. Mary made a point of being at every event that involved the boys' deaths. At every press conference, and even at Brian's funeral, Mary pushed her way through the crowds of people that gathered to get a better look. When Brian's coffin was brought out to lead the procession to the graveyard for his burial, an officer spotted Mary. When Brian's little coffin went past her, she burst out in gleeful laughter. Alarmed at the joy the preteen seemed to get from the sight, he reported it to Burrows, who added it to his growing list of complaints about Mary and Norma. A few days after the funeral, an 8-year-old boy was brought to the station, accompanied by his parents. The boy had serious handicaps. He was mentally limited to the intelligence of a 4-year-old, and what he told officers, to the best of his ability, was nothing short of horrifying. He said he came across Mary when she was leading Brian to Tin Lizzie on the day of the murder, and Mary invited him to tag along. Once they were at the cement blocks where Brian would later be found, Mary told them that they had sore throats and that she was going to make them feel better. Once she had an excuse to get her fingers around the boys' throats, her grip would tighten until they couldn't breathe. The 9-year-old managed to struggle free, and he ran away, leaving Brian to the mercy of Mary's murderous game of doctor and patient. The witness only mentioned Mary, but Burrows decided to bring both Mary and Norma in for questioning, since almost all of the reports mentioned the two of them together. Norma was released into police custody willingly by her parents, but Mary's father was a completely different case. Billy threatened to put their family's German Shepherd on them if they dared step foot in the house, while Mary sat in the living room on the knee of one of her father's friends. Betty was nowhere to be seen. They did eventually get Mary to the police station, and in the presence of child psychologists, they started questioning the girls in separate rooms. Norma requested that she speak to the officers without her father present, and the moment her father stepped out of the room, Norma started telling them what happened on the day that Brian died. At first, she tried to make it seem that Mary had committed the murder alone, and had only brought Norma by later to show off what she had done. But investigators sensed that Norma wasn't being entirely truthful, so they applied a little pressure. It didn't take much for Norma to crack. She said that she and Mary both led Brian away to the junkyard. He still had the scissor he'd been playing with in his hand, and Norma took it from him. Mary then wrestled the toddler to the ground, attempting to strangle him, but her hands got tired and she asked Norma to take over. But Norma, alarmed and horrified at the frenzied state that Mary was in, ran away in fear. When she left the scene, Brian was still alive and she left the scissors lying in the grass. She said that Mary found her sometime later and brought her back to the site where Brian was already dead. This time Mary had a razor blade with her, and she used it to cut and mutilate Brian's remains. When she was done, Mary hid the razor under one of the cement blocks. Oddly, she never mentioned the mentally incapacitated boy who claimed to have witnessed the crime, but then again, he'd never mentioned Norma's presence either. So it's been concluded that Mary lured him there at a later time, possibly when Brian was already deceased and before she fetched Norma. The child's limited mental capacity, combined with the trauma of being attacked and possibly seeing Brian's dead body, might have caused him to get the sequence and details of the event wrong. Who knows, neither Norma nor Mary ever corroborated his version of events. Regardless of the anomaly, police allowed Norma to lead them to the place where the razor was hidden, and sure enough, they found it. Mary, on the other hand, wasn't giving the police much to go on. The girl jumped from topic to topic, avoiding any mention of Brian. She wanted to know if her mother was going to come and see her, and she worried about the family dog if she wasn't home to feed it. She also spoke of her best friend Norma and how much fun they had playing together. After 4 hours of getting nothing out of Mary, police tried a different tactic. They lied and said that Mary was seen on the grounds of Tin Lizzie with Brian. Mary simply responded that whoever saw her there must have had very good eyesight to see someone who wasn't there. Mary had an unnerving habit of predicting what investigators were going to ask next. She ended the interview on her own terms, telling them that she wasn't going to allow them to brainwash her into admitting anything. It became starkly apparent that they weren't working with just any child killer. Mary was whip-sharp and much more intelligent than Norma. She read the grown men's next move like an open book. Mary was cold and calculating, and she wasn't going to allow fear and emotional games to interfere with her responses. Frightening her into a confession with the usual tactics wasn't going to work like it did with other 11-year-olds. Like everything and everyone else Mary encountered, she took the lead in the interrogation room, full of seasoned investigators who dealt with hardened, sly criminals every day. After a fruitless day of interviewing Mary and a jumbled confession from Norma, both girls were taken to care homes in Newcastle, separate from each other, while police reconvened. They needed to come up with a different approach if they were going to get anything out of Mary at all. The statements of a boy and a girl who were both mentally challenged wasn't going to be enough to validate an arrest. In the care facility, Mary was the exact opposite of the belligerent and disturbingly unfazed girl that challenged the detectives in the interrogation room. The adults who minded Mary at the center were very taken with the vivacious and funny child. They said that she was inquisitive and lively, with a talent for making even the adults laugh with her witty remarks and quick quips. According to them, Mary was incredibly bright and excelled when she was given the opportunity to learn. The only time Mary showed any unhappiness was when she asked when her mother was coming to visit. But Betty never came to see her daughter at the care center. A teacher at Mary's school went over her workbooks and the newsletter that she'd written. Now, with the knowledge that she was most likely a murderer, the notes and doodles suddenly looked an awful lot like the details written down by a deeply disturbed and haunted child. He handed everything Mary had written over the last 2 months over to the police. This gave them enough to start laying down evidence in front of Mary, hoping to drive fear into her. And it worked, sort of. Mary denied them any direct response when they presented her with the pictures she'd drawn of the medication that was found in the apartment where Martin was found. They showed her the obscenities written on the wall of the nursery, Her playground confessions to the other children were read out loud, and she was faced with the detail about the scissors that both she and Norma had mentioned, vital information that the public did not know about. Mary left them that day without confessing to anything, but when she returned the next day, she held in her hand a handwritten account of the events that had transpired on the day Brian had died. According to her version, Norma was the one who committed the murder. She also added a detail that Norma tried to kill her dog with the razor blade that she used on Brian's corpse, but it growled at her. So Mary took her German Shepherd home in terror. Again, no mention of the boy who'd witnessed the crime ever came up. Mary signed her confession, Mary F. Bell. The two confessions were similar enough to get a warrant to arrest Mary and Norma. The girls were standing next to each other when they were formally charged on August 8, 1968, for the murder of Brian Howe. In a moment of uncharacteristic anger, Norma said to Mary that she'd done nothing wrong and that she would get Mary back for the predicament that Mary had put her in. Each girl was assigned her own cell, away from the other incarcerated adults at Newcastle's West End police station. Child psychologists and childminders came and went. Authorities in Newcastle had never dealt with killers this young before. There just weren't any clear laws about the rights of children this age who were being held in prison for crimes as brutal as this. They had no idea how the girls would handle their isolated incarceration while they waited for their time in court. So they tried to meet the children's needs the best they could by getting the proper authorities to evaluate them and making sure that they were rarely left alone in their cells. Norma and Mary waited 4 months before their trial began on December 5th. Many years later, a similar case would hit the courts when Robert Thompson and John Venables, aged 10, were tried for the murder of 2-year-old James Bulger. Besides the similarities in the perpetrators' ages and the ages of their victims, there was also the question in both cases about whether or not it should be handled in high court, with a jury and all of the proceedings intact for a full criminal murder trial. But in the end, both cases were allowed to go through the justice system as per usual. Regardless of the accused's ages, a murder was still being prosecuted, and a terribly horrific murder at that. Charging Mary for the murder of Martin Brown was never on the table. She never admitted to it when she was questioned about it. And if Mary had indeed killed Martin, and the police were sure that she had, all they had for evidence was a sketch of a bottle of pills in a school workbook. If they were going to put her away for anything, their best shot was to put all of their confidence behind Brian's murder and hope it was enough to convince a jury of her guilt. But Mary and Norma were allowed a level of privacy that Venables and Thompson were not. With less media and television available at the time, their court dates were kept very hush-hush. There were no flashing cameras and mobs in the street waiting for them as they entered and exited the courtroom, like what waited outside of every court date in the James Bulger case. The judge also allowed their lawyers to sit next to them during cross-examinations, hoping to put the girls more at ease if they felt like they had someone familiar close to them. Norma struggled on the stand, even with her lawyer next to her for support. The stress of the entire room with its eyes on her and the questions coming in one after the other had a visibly distressing effect on the girl. She stumbled over her words, and the judge halted proceedings on numerous occasions so that Norma could collect herself again. But Mary was not so easily fazed. She answered questions in a clear and concise manner, needing very little help from her attorney. The only time she ever faltered was when the judge asked her whether or not she had ever tried to strangle a pigeon. Mary burst into tears at the mention of hurting an animal, and the court needed to take a break until she calmed down enough to continue. But other than that, the child seemed unusually well put together, and she never flinched or showed any outward emotion at the mention of the details surrounding the murder, or when photographs of the crime scene were presented to the court. Their stories remained almost exactly the same, but with each other's roles reversed. The jury decided almost immediately that the timid and rather intelligent Norma wasn't capable of a violent attack unless she was led into it. Mary, the bright one, had to be the one calling the shots. And the testimony of the girls' teachers and the psychologists and childminders that they were assigned during their stay in the care homes and prison cells was what drove the nail in the coffin, so to speak. According to the professionals, Norma was feeble-minded, weak, and did not have the capability or temperament to take charge of any situation, never mind a murder. But Mary, on the other hand, was highly intelligent, and she did not have the emotional range that normal children do. They described her as psychopathic and a devious little fiend, morbidly fascinated by death. A child wrought with demons that had no place being out in the world among the sane and respectable members of society. After 9 days in court, Mary Bell was found guilty of causing the death of Brian Howe. But Norma was deemed too feeble indeed to have been fully aware of the implications of her part in the murder of Brian Howe. She went back to Scotswood, while Mary was to await her sentencing. Upon hearing the verdict, Mary cried into her lawyer's shoulder. Finally, Mary showed some kind of emotion when she was presented with the enormous implications of her actions, but it was too little, too late. Now the courts had the task of deciding an appropriate punishment. Had Mary been an adult, it would have been a simple course of events. But Mary was just 11. Never in the history of the British legal system had they ever had to deal with this kind of problem before. There was no set of rules to go by. If they were going to come to a decision at all, then they'd have to write the handbook for the course of action then and there. Surprisingly, the public wanted a humane sentence for the child. Punish her, yes, but allow Mary to have a second chance in the world as an adult when she comes of age. Give her the opportunity to be rehabilitated, they said. She was much too young to be held by the same standards as adults. In the end, the court agreed. Mary's conviction was overturned to that of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility due to her young age. She would spend her adolescent life in a juvenile detention centre among the other child criminals in Lancaster. Her release was yet to be decided when she first qualified for parole, as soon as she was at least 16. While she waited to turn 16, Mary was to be held at the Red Bank Community Centre for juvenile offenders. Almost 30 years later, John Venables was held here too, after being found guilty of murdering James Bolger. Though the parents of the murdered boys were not happy with the verdict, the rest of Britain at least agreed that this was the best route to take. The officers and detectives who worked on the case felt that the girls were too young to be tried as adults. On that, at least, they were in agreement with the courts. But none of them felt that Norma should have gotten off free. They felt that she was not nearly as simple-minded as it seemed, and that she knew perfectly well the difference between right and wrong. Norma knew too many details to have just been an innocent bystander. Even if she didn't kill anyone, she at least played a greater part in the crimes than she'd led on. To them, Mary took the brunt of the punishment, while Norma faced no repercussions at all. While Norma went free, Mary was given access to a good education, taught to play instruments, and given more attention and care than she'd ever known in her life, even if it was behind bars. While incarcerated, Mary again proved to be a cheeky and delightful child to care for once the proper supervision and rules were put in place. Precocious and exceptionally intelligent, she attracted everyone in her vicinity toward her with her magnetic personality. But the psychiatrists who worked with her had some interesting takeaways from the many years Mary spent under their care. They believed that the lack of loving parental care and the abandonment she'd experienced as an infant made it almost impossible for Mary to form emotional connections with people at all. Her detachment from the natural human need to form relationships made her an expert at reading people and acting according to the expectations of her environment. She lied easily and convincingly enough, and without remorse, to get herself out of trouble when she needed to, and to them at least, all of Mary's interactions were superficial. Her friendships were chosen as a means to an end and never truly genuine. Mary never admitted to the crime during her time behind bars and avoided discussing Brian, Martin, or Norma at all costs. For the most part, Mary didn't cause any trouble, and she adjusted marvelously to the rigorous schedule and constant supervision that the centre had in place, unless, that is, when Betty came around. Betty hadn't made much effort to see Mary during her initial incarceration and trial, but once she was permanently held at Red Bank, Betty came around frequently. After Betty's visits, Mary would turn sour and moody, lashing out with obscenities and tantrums at the slightest perceived provocation. The effect that Betty had on her was obviously a negative one, but the staff could not deny a mother the right to see her child, so they could not stop the visits unless Mary refused to see her. Mary would later say that Betty took every opportunity she could to tell her daughter that the people in Scotswood hated her and that she was going to go to hell for her sins. Betty has since stated that these accusations are all fabricated. In 1972, 4 years after Mary was found guilty, Betty gave a very strange interview to a TV station who paid her to sit down for them. Throughout the interview, Betty kept her eyes down and spoke only in a soft monotone. She did not cry, she did not laugh, and she barely showed any emotion at all. Betty did not deny her daughter's guilt, nor did she admit to the terrible things that happened in that house. She did, however, say that the situation was very stressful and hard for her, and that Mary's actions had put the family to shame, causing all of them great hardship and trauma. Betty sold a copy of every letter that Mary ever wrote to her to the highest bidder. Despite her rocky relationship with her mother and Betty's habit of selling information about her daughter to the public, Mary continued to do well in the system. That's until she turned 16. Mary applied for parole before she could be transferred to the much harder conditions of adult prison. Her parole was denied, and the transfer went through in 1976. The prison Mary was sent to is an unusual one. Askham Grange Open Prison is more like a halfway house than a true prison. It allows its inmates a great deal of freedom to allow them the opportunity to show that they can be trusted with the responsibility that comes without bars and locks to keep them detained. The prisoners are allowed to work in the surrounding area, and they get to attend classes with the rest of the public to learn skills like secretarial work and hairdressing. Mary signed up to learn to become a secretary, and she even worked as a waitress for a few months. But before her first year at the facility was over, Mary and another inmate, Annette Priest, who was a convicted prostitute and thief, escaped the facility. Along with 2 men, they spent the next few days visiting amusement parks and going shopping. In all fairness, neither Mary nor her fellow inmate committed any crimes during their 4 days on the run. By all accounts, it was a harmless joyride of sorts, where Mary got to experience the lights and rides of an amusement park for the first time in her life. They were caught fairly quickly and taken straight back to Askham. Their only punishment was that their privileges were taken away for a month. Finally, in May 1980, Mary was released from prison at the age of 23. She was deemed no longer a threat to society and allowed the right to a new name to protect her identity. Mary's story doesn't end here. For years, the public speculated about where she could be, but Mary managed to remain undetected. That's until 1998, when she collaborated with an author to write her autobiography. The public was outraged that Mary received payment for her part in writing the book. The families of the victims were aghast that Mary was allowed to profit from the murder of their children. But the £50,000 Mary got were already spent, so there wasn't much anyone could do about the unpleasant affair. In the book, Mary detailed the sexual abuse she endured from her mother and how Betty started selling Mary to her clients. She also claimed that she was abused by male staff members while she was held at Red Bank, a claim that Red Bank vehemently denies to this day. Mary disappeared back into the shadows for a few years, until 2003, when a Scottish newspaper discovered Mary's identity and her place of residence. The then 46-year-old was living in a coastal town with her 14-year-old daughter, who, until that point, had no knowledge of her mother's past. Mary took her daughter and fled from town to town while battling in the courts to grant her and her teenage daughter the right to permanent anonymity. They were hounded by the media and the public for nearly a year before she won the case and disappeared yet again. The judge commented that Mary had raised a very well-adjusted daughter and was in every way a success story of rehabilitation. She'd gained all that she needed from the help provided to her in the prison system to become a model citizen. He further commented that the public and the media's determination to hunt Belle was despicable, and it put Mary's innocent teenage daughter in grave danger. For the rest of Mary's life, we have only the sparse details of those who kept in contact with Mary over the years. From their vague and rare comments, we've been given a very small glimpse into the mysterious life of Mary Bell after prison. Now, in her late 60s, Mary is a grandmother living a quiet life away from the public eye. When her daughter was younger, Mary tried to mend bridges with her unstable mother. But this proved to be a futile attempt. Mary and Betty kept contact with a few visits every now and then, until Betty's death in 1995. But Mary never truly forgave her mother for the abuse and instability that Betty inflicted on her. And Betty always blamed Mary for the suffering she had to go through after the public spectacle that Mary's actions caused. On the bright side, according to one of the men who investigated Brian Howe's murder, Mary went out of her way to be a better parent than Betty was, providing her daughter with all of the love, stability, and safety that she was denied as a child. Those police officers agree, even if the families of Brian and Martin don't, that children who commit crimes can be rehabilitated and go on to live normal and valuable lives if they are given access to the right therapy and support. As for Norma, no one knows where she went or what happened to her. She was granted the same anonymity that Mary was, and there is no mention of her in any public records. But then again, she'd only have made an appearance if she'd ever committed a crime. Norma would be in her 70s today, and we can only assume that she had a quiet life after 1968 too. Undoubtedly, Mary's traumatic upbringing by her mentally unstable and often vicious mother had an effect on her perception of right and wrong. Whether or not she endured the sexual abuse that she claimed she had, Mary definitely underwent her fair share of physical, emotional, and verbal abuse during her formative years. In those first years, she only ever felt some semblance of love from her father and her beloved dog, the only living things she seemed to truly care for, to some degree. To have a child grow up in such terrible conditions, it would be remarkable if Mary didn't blur the lines between violence and gratification. But is the blame all on Betty and the unsafe and violent home that she put in place? Or was Mary born a psychopath, and the circumstances just exacerbated the monster that was already brewing beneath those blue eyes? If Mary's life after prison is anything to go by, then she really was the product of her environment, or an excellent chameleon, capable of putting on a mask that fooled judges, police officers and detectives for decades after committing what is probably the most heinous crime in British history. Tell us what you think in the comments below. Was Mary the product of nature or nurture, or maybe a little bit of both? And how do you propose child killers be handled in the legal system? Because there is certainly no shortage of homicidal youths in the prison system nowadays. If you liked this video, have a look at some of the other in-depth looks into the most depraved corners of humanity on your screen right now. Until next time, make sure your children feel all of the love and safety that Mary never got to experience, because it might make a difference.